Tonight we're going to continue this series and talk about a fear of failed expectations. Anybody have a fear of failed expectations? Yeah? Like, here's the idea. And this is really a lie that we believe and buy and follow. It's that I'm afraid it won't work out like I expect, so I just won't try. It's a fear of failed expectations. Anybody honest enough to say that's me? I'm afraid it's not going to turn out the way I expect it to, so instead of trying it, I'm just not going to try. Yeah, if we're completely honest and we're saying, I have thought that before, I've said that before, I've lived that way before, I think we'd all probably find ourselves in that boat. So you think about that. Have you allowed a fear of failed expectations to direct your life? You haven't tried something because you're afraid it's not going to come out the way you think it should, so why even start it in the first place? How do you respond when things don't go the way you hope they would? How do you react or cope with situations that go differently and people fall short of your expectations? Are you going to give in to the thoughts of negativity, discouragement, and self-destruction, or are you going to hold on to the truth that God speaks? And so my hope in all this is that you will see that a life that is not directed by fear but lived in the truth and promises of God will be a much more fulfilling life, right? So let me say this. Maybe you've had a time when something, how many of you have had a time when something did not turn out the way you expected? Yeah? Okay. Everyone over here, everything turns out the way you expect? All the time, every time? Oh, you were just looking down and didn't respond. So maybe, guys, there was a dance at school, and you had an idea that you were going to ask this one girl to go to the dance with you, but then somebody asked her before you got there, and it didn't turn out the way that you expected. Maybe you had high hopes you were going to go to this concert. It was like your favorite person, and they were just not as good live as they were when you listened to them on your iPod, right? And it's like it falls short of your expectations. Maybe you started the school year and thought, this is going to be my year. Everything's going to go great, and nothing is going the way that you planned, and it's not turning out as you expected. Maybe you look at your family life, and you think that your family would be a certain way, and then divorce happens, and all of a sudden your family life and your dream of what you thought it would be is not what you expected. What thoughts go through your mind when your expectation and reality do not meet? It's the question that you want to answer to yourself. How can you go on when your dreams have been crushed because your expectations are falling short? And I think we're gonna look tonight a little bit into the life of Paul to kind of get a glimpse of what he says we should do. And in fact, this week and next week at least, we're going to look a little bit at Paul each week. But Paul was at one time a guy who persecuted Christians. You guys know what that means?
Yes.
He persecuted. Hey, can we hit the blue on these lights overhead? I think it's the third channel, Fred, the third preset. That's a little better. That's a little better. I feel like I'm not blinded. I can see you guys a little bit. Thank you, Fred. Everybody give Fred a hand. He's learning lights and sound and computer. So I appreciate these guys willing to step out and learn something to help us out. So thank you, fellas. Appreciate you. But Paul was at one time a guy who persecuted Christians. He was radically changed by Jesus as he was traveling to a city called Damascus. Jesus met up with him, and he was blind for a few days. And Jesus showed up and said, Paul, I want you to go and preach. And so he became a preacher. He was a church planner. And most of the New Testament is written by Paul. The letters that we see in the New Testament came from Paul. So he traveled around Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey and Greece and Syria, and he was planting churches. He eventually ended up in Italy, in Rome. But this guy, when Jesus said, I want you to go and preach the gospel to people that have never heard the good news, it probably didn't go through Paul's mind that he would go to places and they would yell at him. It probably didn't go, Paul's expectation wasn't that he was going to be called names or that he would show up in a town to bring them good news and hope, and they would be like, get out of here, Paul. We don't want anything to do with you or this Jesus that you're talking about. And they would run him out of town. In fact, Paul was almost killed. Paul was shipwrecked, and he spent nights hungry and cold. But he also had times when he had everything that he needed taken care of. And so Paul had this wide range of experiences in life. And oftentimes I would think that it wasn't his expectation that he would come almost to death. In fact, some people believe Paul actually died and was brought back to life. Like, he was beaten so severely and thrown out of this town one time, they thought he was dead. And then he got up and went right back into town. So that's pretty crazy, right? But Paul wrote a letter to a church in a city called Philippi. And so that's the book of Philippians in the Bible. In Philippians chapter 1, this is written, most people believe this was written towards the end of Paul's life. And this is a people that he loved dearly, the people of the church in Philippi. And so he writes a lot of personal things to them. But look at how he starts. After he introduces himself in Philippians 1 and 2, he says this, starting in verse 3 of Philippians chapter 1. He says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you. So he's thinking about them, and he's thanking God for them. Always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. So you have this big lie that I'm not even going to try because it might not meet my expectations, right? But the big truth the first one is this. If you find yourself in a place you did not expect, God has not forgotten you. This is why you should not let fear of failed expectations control you, because you might get to a place that you don't know what's going on. You didn't expect to be here. But you have to know that even in that place, God has not forgotten you. So don't be afraid to move forward and try something new. So a little background. Like I said, Philippi is a city. And so the people there are Philippians. Like, we live in Emporia, and we are Emporians. Or if you live in Olpe, you're an Olpian. Or if you're in Americus, you're an Americusian. That's kind of a fun one. Americusian. I think that's what I think that's official. A what? Amarian, yeah. So Paul is writing to this church, these churches he's planted in Philippi. And Philippi is a Roman colony, and they're very proud of being Roman, and they didn't really want to hear too much about non-Roman gods. And so because of that, the believers in Philippi and Paul himself were persecuted because they are proclaiming a non-Roman God to be the true God. And so the believers there are being harassed. And Paul, in fact, when he wrote this letter to this church, was in prison. He was in prison in Rome. And so he's sitting in a jail cell. He's being guarded every day, all day. He's having to have people come and take care of his needs. He can't work for himself any longer, take care of himself any longer, because he's trapped in prison. And look at what he says. And I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. So think about this. If we were living, let's say in China, where persecution of Christians is very common, and you can't really openly practice your faith without facing some persecution, then we have people that are constantly harassing us, calling us names. They're threatening us because of just our faith in Jesus. And Paul's saying, hey, I'm thankful for you. I'm glad for you. And know this, that God has begun something in you, and he's going to finish it. Or think of how the Philippians are reading this, and they know Paul's in prison. They're like, Paul, what are you even thinking? You're in prison. How is God going to complete anything in your life while you're in a jail cell, while you're wrapped up in chains? Paul, it doesn't seem like a very good work. How can you say that God is doing a good work when we're being persecuted and you're in prison? Paul, how can you say that things are going to turn out all right in the way that we planned? What do you mean that this good work is going to be finished? And, if we were honest, we'd probably be having those same thoughts, wouldn't we? If we were in prison, if we were actively being persecuted day in and day out because of our faith. But Paul wanted these believers that he loved to know that truth, that if you find yourself in a place you did not expect, you have to remember that God has not forgotten you. When things don't turn out the way you hope, Satan wants you to think that God has abandoned you, that he's forgotten you, that he's gotten away from you, and he's made this big distance between you and him. Satan wants you to feel like God doesn't love you. But those are lies, right? There's a lady, this picture I found is Corrie ten Boom and her sister Betsy ten Boom. And these ladies lived during World War II. And they were Christians, and they were helping to hide Jews. And there's a book that's written about them. I think it's a play and a movie as well called The Hiding Place. But because they were hiding Jewish people from the Nazis, they were labeled as outlaws. Even though they were believers in Jesus and they had their faith in him, they were put into a concentration camp during World War II. And, you think they probably didn't expect that was going to be where they would be landing themselves, right? They think they're doing something good. They're helping to hide people, Jewish people, from an evil government that wanted to kill them and exterminate them. And so they're thinking they're doing the right thing. And even though they were doing the right thing, they end up in this concentration camp. And Corrie ten Boom didn't expect to find herself there. She was fighting for her life in that camp. And she said that there were many people around her who struggled with the idea that they thought God had forgotten them there. And Corrie even felt that. And in this book she wrote, "I remember one occasion when I was very discouraged there. Everything around us was dark, and there was darkness in my heart. I remember telling Betsy that I thought God had forgotten us. 'No, Corrie,' said Betsy, 'he has not forgotten us. Remember his word, for as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is his steadfast love towards those who fear him.'" And so when Corrie was in a dark place where she didn't expect to be and she thought God had abandoned them, her sister reminded her of truth. She was hearing the lies of Satan that everything around them is darkness and you're full of darkness and this place is darkness and God has abandoned you. And her sister reminded her of the truth of God, that God's love for us is beyond anything that we can imagine. God hasn't forgotten his plan for you. If you find yourself in a place that you didn't expect, if you think that things have not turned out the way that you would hope, you have to remember that God has not forgotten about you. He's not forgotten you in your situation. You may feel like he's abandoned you, but he's right there with you. And at the right time, he's going to bring you into the fullness that he has planned for you. Like Paul said, he's going to complete the good work that he started in you. And Paul went on in Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 14. Listen to what he wrote to these believers. He said, "I want you to know, brothers," and that would be an all-inclusive, brothers and sisters, if you want to be real technical about it. But so he's including everybody in that. "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel." Did you hear that? Paul's saying that what my situation right now, I'm in prison, I'm in chains, I'm under guard, has happened to advance the gospel, to let people know about Jesus, in other words. In verse 13, he says, "So that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." So I want you to write this second truth. If you feel like, you just are not, it's not going to turn out the way I expected to, so I'm not even going to try. If fear of unfulfilled expectations is keeping you back, this second truth: God is always at work behind the scenes in ways that you cannot imagine. God is always at work behind the scenes in ways that you can't imagine. So here's Paul in prison, chained up. He's there because he's preaching about Jesus, and the Jews wanted to kill him. And so instead, he got himself turned over to the Romans. And instead of just going to trial and getting set free, he sees it's not going to go his way. He says, "I appeal to Caesar," which means that he's got to go and present his case to Caesar himself in Rome, because Paul was a Roman citizen. And so he makes this long trip, and all sorts of crazy stuff happens, and Paul ends up going to Rome, and he's in prison. And because he's there, he preaches to the guards. Think of this. These Romans, these imperial guards, probably never would have heard about Jesus because they're surrounded by Romans that talk about Roman gods, right? But Paul, because he's in prison, is put in a situation where he can talk to people that he never would have had a chance to talk to. They never would have gone to a church that he had planted. They would have just believe the way they believe. But because God put Paul in prison, Paul was able to tell people there about Jesus. And his imprisonment then encouraged other Christians to be more bold in their faith. They were maybe more reluctant to talk out about who Jesus was and what Jesus had done. But when they saw the example that Paul was living, then they became more bold in their faith. God worked it out. When things don't turn out as we expected, many times we feel that all is lost because it didn't fit into the plan that we had created in our own minds. And when that plan that we thought would happen doesn't happen, it seems like there's no hope. Why should I even continue, right? You might be here tonight and you've gone through a tragedy in your life. Maybe you've experienced a death of someone that you loved because of a tragic accident or suicide, and you're like, why did that happen? Maybe you've experienced the pain of divorce in your family. Maybe you've had to struggle through torment from people at school or at home. Maybe you've had to struggle with a sickness that you didn't understand. And I don't know why this junk happens. And all I can say is we live in a broken world. And bad stuff sometimes happen even to good people. But I know that God is always working behind the scenes in these things. And we may not see what he's doing, but he's working. You may not know for years why something happened, but you might come to a point in your life where you meet somebody who's going through the exact same junk that you went through. And because God brought you through it, you're able to help them through it. And God's able to take what was pain in your life and help you bring healing in somebody else's life. Because God's always working, even when we don't see it. He's always working behind the scenes. These situations sometimes make us kind of revert and become inward. They make us only think about ourselves. They might make us more fearful. The fear of failed expectations wants to take over your thoughts and make you believe that you deserve what's happened. It makes you want to believe that there's no hope, and it wants you to listen to the lies that God doesn't care about you. But when that happened in Corrie ten Boom's life, her sister Betsy was able to speak God's truth to her. And if you're struggling with fear because of a situation that's happened, I want to remind you that 1 John chapter 4, verse 18 says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear." We don't have to be controlled by our fears because the perfect love of Jesus can push those things out of our life. Fear lies, but God's voice is truth. God knows where you are. God is at work. So what voice are you going to believe? There are some of you in this room today who are in a place that you didn't expect to be in. It might be at school. It might be a place you didn't expect to be in at home. It might be a place you didn't expect to be in with your friends. Maybe you're in a place where things aren't going like you thought they would. And when you find yourself in that place, one of the greatest emotions that you'll battle is a fear of failed expectations and doubt. We can doubt that God cares. We can doubt that God is working. We can doubt that things are going to turn out and they're going to turn around. We can doubt that it's even worth going on. And if this is you, I want you to remember one last phrase, and it's the last fill-in on your sheet tonight. I want you to lock this in your mind. I want you to just keep it for when the enemy tries to attack you. And it's this: when in doubt, remember that God is working it out. When in doubt, remember that God is working it out. And sometimes you've just got to say to yourself, I'm not going to doubt about this. I'm not going to fear about this. I know that God is in control and he's going to take care of it. When in doubt, remember that God is working it out. You have to know this truth. God loves you. God knows you. God is working behind the scenes in ways that you can't even imagine. And you can know that the word says that if he begins a good work in you, he's going to finish it. God doesn't have unfinished projects. I've got a lot of unfinished projects in my basement. But that's not how God works. When he begins something, he finishes it. And he's begun a good work in you, and he wants to bring it to completion through Jesus Christ. So what do you have to do? Hang on. You've got to hang on and speak truth to yourself. When in doubt, I know that God is working it out. Let's pray tonight. Jesus, I thank you for the opportunity that we've had to look into your word. And I pray that you would help us to hang on to the truth. Lord, that we know that you are working the situations of our life, even the ones that have not really met our expectations. You're working them out, Lord. And you've begun a good work in us, and you're going to finish it, Jesus. Lord, I pray that we'd remember that you are constantly working behind the scenes, even when we don't see what's going on. And Lord, I pray that we would put our trust and our hope in you.